If you are joining us for the first time, hello and welcome. If you are a returning supporter and friend, welcome back. This is Unboxing Economics. Today we'll be talking about the amazingly significant, tumultuous, unprecedented, and little known fact in not only Australian political history, but Australian national history. Sometimes referred to as the constitutional crisis, today we'll be taking a look back at the dismissal of the Prime Minister in 1975 by His Excellency the Governor-General. We will be taking a look back at how such an event came to pass, some detail about the parties involved, the constitutional and legal positions taken, events that led up to the dismissal, and perhaps most interestingly, should it have happened and was it right? Let's get straight into it. Firstly, let's look at the individuals involved. Number 1, Mr. John Malcom Fraser, leader of the Parliamentary Liberal Party and leader of the opposition from March 1975, after winning leadership from Mr. Billy Snedden. Fraser would go on to win the 1975 election post-crisis and would remain incurably until March 1983. Fraser probably did the least and benefited the most from this whole ordeal. Next we have Mr. Edward Gough Whitlam, who became the Prime Minister after winning the 1972 election. This was after 23 years and 9 consecutive terms of Liberal Country Party coalition rule. The nation and the Labor Party were hungry for change. Whitlam was returned as Prime Minister with a reduced majority at the 1974 election, only to be dismissed the following November. Thirdly, Sir John Robert Kerr, who was Governor-General from July 1974 until 1 week after the dismissal. Sir John was the 7th shortest serving Governor-General of the 18 in Australian history up until that point. However, in the mere 3 years he was in office, he did more than any of his predecessors. The final slap in the face was that Kerr was not reappointed by Fraser to the Governor-Generalship after Fraser won the election post-crisis. Lastly, Sir Garfield Edward John Barwick. Sir Garfield was a former Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia. He was also one of the most well-known, well-respected and eminent legal authorities and legal minds this country has ever produced. Sir Garfield was asked by Sir John for his legal opinion on the crisis from a constitutional and a moral point of view. Before we get into the events leading up to the crisis, let's talk a bit about the background. The central conflict of the crisis was between convention and the reserve powers of the Governor-General. Let's define each. Firstly, parliamentary convention. Convention is essentially a gentleman's agreement or social contract where there is nothing written or legally enforceable, but a word given by 2 or more parties. A legal precedent is also a similar but separate concept. More formally, convention is defined as an uncodified and repeatable course of action or procedure conducted by a state institution or individual. This idea of the use of convention is common in Commonwealth nations, especially those that use the British Westminster parliamentary system. Secondly, and importantly, the reserve powers. The Governor-General is the Queen's representative in Australia and the Parliament, the Queen being the head of state of the country. The Governor-General was seen as a primarily ceremonial and figurehead role. Even post-crisis until today, this is a commonly held public view. The scope and functionality of the role of the Governor-General is mentioned in sections 2 and 61 of the Constitution. The reserve powers of the Governor-General are referred to in several sections of the Constitution, including sections 5, 57, 58 and 64. These powers give the Governor-General the authority to act as the Queen's representative in a decisive, significant and immediate manner. These powers include the ability to dismiss ministers, to appoint ministers, or to refuse royal assent to bills. The main section we are concerned about today is section 64, the ability of the Governor-General to appoint or dismiss ministers. Note the Constitution doesn't mention political parties or the Prime Minister. These have become of use over time through convention. The problem lies in inconsistencies or difference between the reserve powers and convention. The Governor-General, by convention, is to act on the advice of the Prime Minister. However, the Governor-General can dismiss the Prime Minister using the reserve powers. By convention, a Prime Minister who cannot obtain supply should seek a general election. However, another convention is that a Prime Minister who retains the majority support of the House of Representatives, which Mr. Whitlam did in this case, should remain Prime Minister. This muddying of the waters further illustrates the difficulty and interactions between convention and the reserve powers. A few questions for history remain. Number 1, was this the very confluence of events that the original drafters of the Constitution thought could become a reality, and thus the reserve powers, while drastic, were very necessary? Number 2, did Sir John Kerr simply want his place in the pages of Australian history? There were several events in the long lead up to the crisis, the first of which was the 1972 election. Whitlam's Labor Party defeated the Liberals by 67 seats to 58 in the House of Representatives. However, Whitlam's Labor Party did not control the Senate. This was the first Labor victory in 23 years. The "Yes, it's time" slogan was agreed to by the Australian public. Having a somewhat hostile Senate makes it difficult to get bills through the Senate, the upper house of the Parliament. Then the 1974 election rolled around, which was a double dissolution election where Whitlam again defeated Billy Snedden and the Liberal Party. Labor got 51.7% of the vote, a 1% swing against the government. Whitlam had a healthy majority in the House of Representatives, 66 seats to 61. However, this time the Senate was deadlocked. This position makes passing bills even more difficult for the government. This would make the problems encountered in their previous parliamentary term even more challenging. Next up is what became known as the Loans Affair. During much of 1974 and well into 1975, the Minister for Minerals and Energy, Rex Connor, was seeking to borrow funds for a major infrastructure project through Western Australia. The project was to cost several $1 billion, an almost unheard of amount of borrowings for an Australian government of the time. Connor sought to seek these funds from Pakistani money broker Tirath Kimlani. This was unusual for two reasons. Firstly, Connor wanted to find and organise the funds and the loan himself, and not have any assistance from the Treasury. And second, sourcing funds from the Middle East instead of the US, UK or Europe, which was far more common for Australian governments of that time. The authority for Connor to negotiate new loans on behalf of the government was withdrawn in May 1975, but Connor did not instruct Kimlani to stop sourcing the loan. There was also some suggestion that Kimlani was not nearly as connected as he suggested and couldn't secure the amount of money he promised. Weeks later, when the timeline was made public about Connor not informing Kimlani to cease sourcing the funds, Connor was sacked as Minister for Energy and Minerals. The Treasurer and Deputy Leader of the Labor Party, Dr. Jim Cairns, was sacked for his involvement in a separate matter. This was about alleged commissions promised to a loan broker if that broker could obtain loans for the government. Next, the seat of Bass, Hayden and the Senate. In June of 1975, the Labor member for the Tasmanian seat of Bass, Mr. Lance Barnard, resigned from the Parliament to take up a diplomatic post, causing a by-election. This by-election swung to the Liberals, giving them a majority in the lower house. This was not only significant in terms of the shift in power that precipitated the crisis, it served as a gauge to Fraser about the public opinion of the Whitlam government's performance in recent times. Also during June of 1975, new Treasurer Bill Hayden presented a budget to the House of Representatives which appeared to be sensible and balanced given the enormity of all current events. However, this budget was eventually blocked by the Liberal opposition-controlled Senate in October 1975. All of this, as well as an ailing economy, record inflation, high unemployment, ongoing oil crises in the Middle East, and the Vietnam War, any government, including Whitlam's, would have had plenty to contend with during 1975. The Liberal Party had plenty of options in the Senate regarding Hayden's budget. These were to pass, reject, or defer. Firstly, if they pass, then government would go on as usual. The pressure would go off the Whitlam government, at least in the short term, and any crisis would be over. Secondly, they could reject the budget, which would go back to the House of Representatives for further discussion and perhaps amendment. The convention in this case would be for the government to go to an election in the event that they could not secure supply of the money bill through the Parliament, hence they could not fund themselves. Or they could simply defer the budget. This was the option the Liberal Party in the Senate opted for. This was a middle ground of sorts, forcing the government to govern without money. This is a position the government could only hold for a short time, more likely weeks than months. A suspicion could be made that both Fraser and Whitlam were playing ego-related political games, each hoping the other would yield, Fraser to pass supply or Whitlam to go to an election. During September and October of 1975, Kerr was in constant consultation with both Fraser and Whitlam, at first to simply gauge the intention of the two leaders. However, towards the end of the crisis, it became clear to Kerr that he may need to intervene, should Fraser and Whitlam not come to a solution. On the 30th of October, Kerr suggested a deal to break the deadlock. The deal was that the Labor government agrees to not call a half-Senate election, which they had hinted at doing so, with a view toward gaining power in the Senate to then pass Hayden's budget. In exchange for this restraint, not calling the half-Senate election, Fraser would agree to pass Hayden's budget without incident. Fraser and the Liberals did not want to agree to this because it let the government off the hook in the short term, and the public support for Whitlam's government had made an unusual and unforeseen rise during September and October 1975. This was a drastic increase in public support from earlier in the crisis, as evidenced by the by-election in June. Whitlam didn't want to resort to this deal either, because Labor would run the risk of not gaining control of the Senate. Either Labor would gain control or they would lose the election and have lost another term of government. Leading up to this, the timeline became important. These factors included the Christmas break for Parliament, the government running out of money, or at least running out of the authority to govern, and the notice required to call an election. Given these factors, the last day for a general election, should it be called, would be the 13th of December 1975. The last opportunity to call one would be the 11th of November. Some questions still remain, of course. Was Fraser simply in the right place at the right time? Should Fraser and Whitlam have made more effort to come to a compromise? Now to Sir Garfield Barwick's involvement. Sir Garfield was a former Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia. He was also a prominent and respected legal mind. As early as the 17th of October, Whitlam insisted that Kerr not get any advice on his involvement in the crisis. Whitlam kept his position clear and consistent that the Governor-General can and should only act in concert with the Prime Minister. Any opinion of any other individuals would therefore be irrelevant. However, Kerr did seek advice from Sir Garfield. Sir Garfield gave an opinion that Sir John had not only the legal and constitutional power to sack the government, but the duty to do so. Another factor to consider is that Sir Garfield was not only a legal authority, he was also a former cabinet minister in the Sir Robert Menzies Liberal government in the 1950s. Moreover, Kerr was a big admirer of Barwick's. Many observers of the crisis rightly asked the question about how politically neutral could Sir Garfield's advice be given these facts. When asked years later about the impartiality of his advice, Barwick remarked that a partisan will never believe anybody could be anything other than partisan. Neither Barwick or Kerr are democratically elected. We, the public, at this point, have two appointed individuals significantly influencing the future of the country at a critical time. This is essentially the direct opposite of what a democratic system ought to be. Barwick himself said that one positive that came out of this crisis was that no future Prime Minister that couldn't secure supply, regardless of the circumstances, would ever again simply push on the way Whitlam did. They would go to an election based on the precedent set by these events. This could be a further oddity where the reserve powers ensure future compliance with convention. As for the questions that still remain, was this an egregious hijacking of our democracy by two individuals that were appointed, not elected? Does this make the label a crisis appropriate? Should Barwick have suspected that Kerr would likely follow his advice to the letter? Should Barwick have tempered his advice, given this knowledge? The day of the 11th of November 1975, a Tuesday, a day that will go down in history. At 0900, Whitlam and Fraser had a final meeting trying to seek a resolution, but none can be made. They both went off to sit for the parliamentary day. Whitlam puts initial plans in place to ask Kerr to call a half-Senate election, as he intended. Kerr writes his letter dismissing the Prime Minister. Kerr's office sends communication to both Fraser and Whitlam to meet Kerr at Government House in Canberra on the same day at different times during the lunch break of Parliament. Whitlam is to be seen first by Kerr to hear the bad news, and then Kerr will see Fraser to inform Fraser of the good news and to have him sworn in as the new caretaker Prime Minister. Fraser had to agree to 4 criteria of Kerr's. Number 1, that an election would be called as soon as practicable. Number 2, the budget would be passed to ensure supply. Number 3, no adverse treatment or retaliation against previous government members or officials. And number 4, that it's a caretaker government only, no appointments or major policy announcements until election day. Fraser agreed to the terms, and later that afternoon the budget was passed by the new caretaker government. A new election was called to be held on the 13th of December, which Fraser and the Liberal coalition won in a landslide, 90 seats to 31, a more than 7% swing towards Fraser. In closing, it seems there are still a few unanswered questions for history to consider. Was Mr. Whitlam the victim or the villain in this saga? Did John Kerr do the right thing, ethically, morally, legally, constitutionally? Like with so many things in history, we seek to answer these questions with only accounts with which to judge. On a personal level, these events were felt most severely by Sir John Kerr. Many members of the public thought he had hijacked our democracy. After 1975, he was personally and professionally ostracised, made very few public appearances, and lived out a very quiet and very private life in the UK until his death in 1991. Fraser went on to become Prime Minister until he was defeated by the Hawke Labour Party in 1983. He then took up several diplomatic posts, the last of which was with the United States. He remained a somewhat prominent public figure and a voice of authority on several issues until his death in 2015. Whitlam remained Labour leader until the 1977 election, where the Labour opposition gained some seats back, but nothing like enough to regain the ground lost during the crisis. He stepped down from the leadership and retired from Parliament 6 months later, in July 1978, after 25 years as a member for Werriwa. In 1999, he and Fraser both supported the Australian Republic movement. He stayed active, healthy and aware until his death in 2014. He was 98 years old. This has been Unboxing Economics. Please like and subscribe. And most importantly, remember, history is more than just a bunch of stuff that happened. Thank you for watching.